Should you go with drums that are deeper or shallower? Let's dig into the different options when choosing shell depth and the impact that they have on the sound. Let's first consider the toms. Over the years, or decades really, drums have gone through a few different standards as far as depths are concerned. Concert toms, power toms, standard size, fast, square. These all refer to a loose standard of drum depth sizes. So if you want your toms to follow a general ratio, the same ratio of diameter versus depth, it's important to know what these are. For example, let's say you were to buy a modern, good drum set from Guitar Center or Sweetwater. Your rack toms follow what DW at least refers to as fast tom depths, and those floor toms typically follow a standard tom depth. But why would you choose one drum depth over another? One of the impacts due to shell depth has to do with resonance. So you hit the drum, it makes noise, right? Well, initially, you're mostly hearing the top head. And then two things happen after that. First, that top head, when you hit it, it pushes the head down. That compresses air inside of the shell, and that air eventually pushes down and hits the bottom head, causing the bottom head to resonate. Additionally, when you hit the head, it causes the shell to resonate, and those vibrations also eventually make their way down to the bottom head. What's important to note is that the deeper the drum, the longer it takes for those things to happen. Ever notice that depending on how you tune the drum, it sometimes makes this pitch bending noise like boom, boom? Well, that's because you're initially hearing mostly the top head, and then over a little bit of time, you're hearing the more kind of overall sound of the drum. The deeper the drum, the longer it takes until that pitch bending happens. When you see a DW drum listed as a fast tom depth, that drum is usually an inch shallower than your standard depth. That allows that drum to sing out a little bit quicker or faster, if you will. The flip side of this is that they may not resonate for so long. Without any other changes, they're faster to resonate and then faster to stop resonating. If you wanted an even shorter sound on your toms, you might want to consider a concert tom, which is shallower than a fast tom. For example, let's say you had a drum and it's 10 inches in diameter. A 9-inch depth would be standard, 8-inch would be fast. So your concert tom is going to be more like a 6-inch depth. Now, if you were to go on DW's website, they don't necessarily call out anything as concert toms, but if you look at the short stack section, that's what you would consider to be more of the depths for concert toms. By the way, a true concert tom in a sense has the bottom head removed, or really doesn't even have the hardware to mount a bottom head. And because of that lack of bottom head, the sound actually becomes very quick. If you wanted more resonance from your toms, then you might want to consider a deeper drum, but just know that sometimes those deeper toms are more difficult to work with. Imagine you had a really deep tom and you were trying to mount it over your bass drum. You might have to have the tom way up for it to be able to fit. That's why sometimes you see if guys have really deep toms, sometimes they'll have one rack tom and it's mounted offset. So it'll be to the left of the bass drum sitting on a snare stand. At one point, DW actually had a best of both worlds option here. They had what they called ESE edges. This was a different bearing edge cut on the bottom part of the shell that allowed the drum to resonate longer. This allowed you to have a fast tom depth, get the resonance faster, without sacrificing how long that resonance was. DW's recommendation was to use these ESE edges on all your rack toms, and when I ordered my DWs, that's what I went with. However, since Roland's bought DW and the DW site has been redesigned, all mention of ESE edges has completely disappeared from the site. So if you go to order a custom kit from DW, inquire through the retailer that you're working with, find out about whether or not DW will still do these ESE edges. In fact, it's possible that DW's just decided to always do the ESE edges now all the time, and you don't have an option to not do it. But since they are a custom shop, they may still give you the option to go one way or the other. Now, I've been talking about the options on fast tom depths for the rack toms quite a bit, but it's possible to get these shorter fast tom depths on your floor toms as well. And that's what I have for my two floor toms, my 14 and my 16. In fact, those floor toms are actually racked. They're mounted on my drum rack, and there's no hardware for drum legs on those toms. Typically, the drum loses a lot of vibration through the legs into the floor. So if you wanted a lot more resonance from your floor toms, the way to go would be to get them off the floor. Make sure that you're not having that contact, and having them mounted up on a stand or a drum rack is the way to go. Now, there's no weight concern here. Like I said, I have a 16-inch tom. Since it is a fast tom depth, it is a little shallower, thus a little lighter. And I don't have any problems with it causing breakages on the mounting hardware. One thing to note, though, is that it does tend to be a little bit of play, a little bit of motion from a drum that size when it is racked. Now, most everything I've said about toms also applies to the bass drum, but there are some additional things to consider. First of all, you may have seen some of these drum sets, like I think Terry Bozzio uses one, where they have these woofers attached to the bass drum. The idea is to have more length, and then you're going to get more resonance out of the drum. These woofers have mostly fallen out of favor. One, because for just your local gigging musicians, just having all that additional space in your car, it's not realistic. Also, I haven't heard that these things actually give you really that much more resonance. Not only that, but consider that usually drummers are trying to control the amount of resonance, cut down on how much there is, as opposed to adding more. For example, think of the Remo Power Stroke 3 drum head. You hit the batter side head, and this little extra piece of plastic opens up and then closes. It helps choke the head. That helps cut down on how long the sound is. People put pillows in their drums or blankets. They will port the resonant side head. All of these things help cut down on how long that note rings out for. So if everyone's just trying to cut down on how much resonance there is, and a shorter drum will help give you less resonance, then why not just do that? Instead of having an 18-inch depth drum, why not cut it in half and have a 9-inch depth drum? It would certainly be cheaper to make and a lot easier to gig with. Depth also affects projection, or how loud the drum is. A shallow kick may work in certain situations, maybe light jazz, maybe when the drums are supposed to be very reserved compared to everything else. You're playing in a very small bar and volume is a major concern of yours. For your typical modern pop, rock, metal, the bass drum and the snare really need to cut through in the mix. By the way, that projection consideration is technically true for your toms as well. Back in I think it was the 70s and the 80s, what they called power toms were very popular. These are drums that were deeper than your standard toms. Finally, that takes us to the snare drum. Snare sizes have gone through a lot of changes over the years. Your piccolo snare has really fallen out of favor. Some people really dig the deeper snares, like an 8-inch. That's practically what you would see on a marching snare, which might be a bit closer to a 10-inch. In fact, deeper snares have actually kind of gone, and come back a little bit. For the most part, though, snares on the market come in one of two sizes, either 5.5 or 6.5 inches. Your 5.5 drum is usually presented as a cheaper option. You'll see it come bundled on your shell packs for the cheaper drum sets. Your mid-high drum sets will come with a 6.5-inch depth instead, usually. And as you get to your very high-end drum sets, those may not come with a snare drum at all. Comparing snares can be difficult because there's so many variables that go into it. In addition to everything we already talked about, consider that the drums may be made from different shell material. You may have a different thickness head on the bottom, a different style wire on the bottom, different tension on those wires. You might have a product like Moon Gel. You might have a specialty batter side head with one of those dots on it. All of these things will have a big impact on the sound. But again, it all comes down to what kind of sound do you want to get out of the drum. People who prefer the 6.5-inch, that slightly deeper one, they tend to say that drum is bit more versatile. They can use it in more styles of music, and maybe it has a little bit of a deeper sound. People who prefer the 5.5 inch, they may say those drums have a better crack to them, quicker attack. One thing to keep in mind is whether or not the drum has reinforcing hoops or re-rings. Sometimes you see that on the shallower drums as well. And that reinforcing hoop is actually going to cause the drum to have a little bit less sustain just because of how it disrupts the vibrations moving through the shell. So if you want a snare that sounds a little fatter, consider a deeper one. If you want one that's quicker, it's got a really in-your-face attack and then gets out of the way, consider one that's shallower. Regardless of the sort of sound you're trying to get from that snare depth, you should really think about how you're going to pair that up with the shell material. In fact, that shell material, be it tone wood or metal, is what you really want to consider first, and then consider the dimensions. And everything you need to know about selecting the right shell material can be found in this video right over here. Until next time, peace.